This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to speak with Edward Yee. Mr. Yee is the owner and senior appraiser at Penelope, Dixon & Associates, where he oversees all appraisals. Additionally, Mr. Yee is an executive board member and president of the Appraisers Association of America and a board member of the Photography Collection Preservation Project. He's taught courses and lectured on the fundamentals of appraising photography and is an expert on the topics of archive valuation to copyright and beyond. Ed, thank you so much for joining me here today on Discussions at the Roundtable.
Thanks a lot. No, happy to be here.
Let's jump into it. So you've built an impressive career in appraisals. Has that always been a passion of yours?
One of those things where when I was in college, the opportunity of saying yes gave me exposure to a world I didn't even know existed. When I entered, there was no appraisal courses. You have to learn by apprenticeship. And I was in college, and Penelope was looking for part-time help and looking at the university, and I thought, sure, why not? Didn't know this world existed. And after just about to graduate, she's like, "Do you want a job?" And I thought, "Sure, why not? I'd love to learn more." So that was I started with her in '96, and in 2003, working for her, we got through Black Star, which was a major photographic archive, about 300,000 photographs. Wow. And upon completing that project, Penelope offered me a partnership. So, basically she offered me the partnership, and the rest, as I say, became history. And what was really nice about it was that, it wasn't so much that I had a passion for appraisals or necessarily even photography, but I did have a passion for history. I certainly enjoyed it. And, I think my first assignment, one of my first, wasn't an appraisal assignment, but, kind of working on the back end, was working on the Bernice Abbott archive, and, looking at the historic photographs from Changing New York and, the WPA projects and things like that, really connected me to a history that I would only read about in books. And, that visual component of it really got me very excited. And so that's always been where the advantage of developing a passion, in early adulthood.
Sure, absolutely. So it's a really interesting field. It's a very broad field as well. How do you remain an expert? What does it mean to be an expert in your field? Is it something that you have to constantly work on? You're appraising things, and I imagine that the market pressures, are changing. How are you able to confidently, continuously evaluate things in a changing marketplace?
So, like anything else, you obviously have to stay abreast. In fact, one of the things that appraisers are required to do is maintain a certain number of continuing education credits. Every 5 years, those have to be met. So that is, going to auctions, for example. Well, not that we go to auctions anymore, but paying attention to auction trends, attending gallery exhibitions, and seeing what's happening for particular artist markets. One of the challenges, of course, is understanding what drives particular markets, and understanding what thankfully, at least in my particular arena, because we have such a very specific focus in photography, you learn what to look for, and you are looking. The broader your depth of knowledge, the more that you see, you're always kind of building on it. And thankfully, the segments of the market that move. It's not the whole market that moves. There are certain portions that move at certain times, or there are certain trends that might happen that you might see as a spike. But attending fairs, photo fairs, different exhibitions, both in the museum and gallery spaces, auctions, and online. There's a lot of information available these days. And,
Sure.
I think that the challenge, because today versus say 20 years ago, the access to information is so much greater. And so, but that increased access to information means having increased expertise and understanding the different levels of the market. And so, I think that being very clear about, what your assignments are, what your objectives are, your scope of work, being very clear about what definitions of value you're using, what the purposes are. Those are all really very, very important things. And in the end, you want to make sure that your valuation conclusions are not only based on data, but well explained.
Sure. And so you've made this career out of appraisals. You've maintained your expertise. Tell me about your first engagement. How did that go? What were did you feel that your expertise was sufficient to satisfy the needs of the attorney?
Absolutely. I was recently contacted actually about one, and it was an interesting because it was a copyright case, and I couldn't, they at that stage because there was no NDA in place, they really couldn't give me a whole lot of details, and I said, listen, this is our photo world is a fairly small world. From what you're describing, it's not kind of making sense. So maybe I can sign an NDA and you can give me a little bit more information. And they
Mhm.
did. And it became abundant. It was interesting because we had actually been contacted by two parties basically describing the exact same material
Wow.
within a couple weeks of each other. And the first party that had reached out, I had to recuse after I realized what the material was. I was like, there's a limited number of people that have had exposure to this. I actually know the person that's named in this suit. I actually need to recuse myself. Like we cannot, we
Wow.
really we can't do it. And it was interesting because again, 2 weeks later, the same call had come in and I had my opinions on, like, I had known what both sides of this case were. Um, and the reality is that I knew something about the case, but the reality is that I did think that expectations were, um, this is why lawsuits happen. Expectations are
Sure.
not necessarily aligned. I knew what my professional opinion on this was, regardless of knowing, one of the parties involved. But it's the exact same thing. We told the other party, sorry, listen, it would not be appropriate. And but in general, we are having to answer your question, and this is somewhat of a dovetail. Talking with the counsel is always been very important. They kind of want to get a handle on where you're at, how you're going to approach it. I have a pending project that's been pending for a year because it's a divorce case. But both counsels, for example, and that's not so much that, I mean, it's not so much as expert witness testimony, but they're looking for an expert witness conclusion in order to be able to have it's community property in order to be able to have it distributed equally. And
Sure.
so, the issues surrounding that case is both parties had to essentially agree. Then the court said, okay, yes, this is the expert witness. But again, that was a matter of having one counsel did take the lead, and because the issues that were involved were complex, because this was a case, or is a case, that involves an artist and their spouse, and so there are different variables here than just say a collector's collection.
Sure.
Because and so it was really important because both sides were actually not. And when I say both sides, this was literally just the attorneys. Not that it was they were using incongruous language that wasn't, like, they were just talking, not talking past, but they had different understandings. So it was
Mhm.
really important to get both counsels, you know, on the phone at the same time and just say, this is it, this is how it'll be approached, and these are the relevant variables as to how we would see it. And so I've always found that being very clear and being compartmentalizing and listening to what is asked of me and answering that to the best of my ability is the best way to approach an expert witness case.
So when you say ask or answer what exactly is asked of you, do you mean that it's important not to go beyond the bounds of that?
That's a good rule of thumb for any appraiser. Appraisers as a group have one trait generally in common. That's not universal, but more often than not, I found that they always want to try and help, and they try to do more than what they may be necessarily contracted to do.
Sure.
And so, you know, of course you give context. Of course you say the things that you are comfortable saying, but you don't necessarily need to. You want the parties to be able to have an understanding. Any good appraiser is going to, you're not going to operate like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. You are really trying to bring some objectivity and some rationale to the overall process.
So did you end up in a court trial for this case?
In both of those, the two that we've discussed, no, not one of them. We recused ourselves, and the second one, we're just waiting on the
It hasn't
parties to
gotten
agree. Yeah, we're waiting on the parties to agree on what is to be appraised.
Have you been in a situation yet that that it has gone to a trial? Have you had a deposition or cross-examination, anything like that yet?
I've had 2 depositions and 1 trial.
How did that go?
The trial was it was very interesting because it was a long. I think in total I must have spent 7 hours on the stand, and
Wow.
it was a very long it was a very long process. But the issue was it was a divorce case. Funny enough, it was a divorce case, and we had been hired by the wife of the artist. The artist was a a regional photographer that had had some degree of success and had editioned prints. And the assignment from the court was to determine the value on the date of the divorce.
Sure.
Fair enough. So we went through the process. Let me just do the math real quick. The difference, and obviously the artist had also had their appraiser, and the spread of difference between the 2 appraisers was 40 times. There was a 40 difference, a 40x difference in value.
Oh boy.
And as you can imagine, that would go to court.
Sure, sure.
So the part that I haven't mentioned up until now, which was actually a very important factor, is that the day after the divorce was filed,
Mhm.
and therefore the date of evaluation, the artist was arrested and ultimately convicted of child pornography
Oh boy.
and was actually serving time at the time that this trial was going on. And the other appraiser had taken the opinion and the point of view that the value of the material should be cost basis only, cost of
Mhm.
material. Whereas we took the value and the market approach, on a market
Sure.
comparison approach. And, a lot of the testimony time, again, it was probably equally split between, both counsels. And the representing counsel that represented our client was basically, have me walk through the process. That part was fairly straightforward. Because obviously when we had gotten to opposing counsel, the question and issue became, well, of course, they're leading, their line of questioning and all of that. We're getting through it. And in the end, it was interesting because I think this must have been probably 10 years ago at this point. But I remember that um, what the council was trying to get on the record was whether or not he could sell any of the prints today. And I said,
Hmm.
absolutely not. I said, he ruined his market. If that was the question, happy to answer it. But I got it on the record. I said, but that wasn't the question. The question was on the day. We had no idea.
Right.
There was no way to know that those forthcoming events would be. I am sorry that is, in terms of the potential payout here. I'm sorry that isn't the case, but that's the court can decide what they want to do with that information. You've asked for a question, I've answered. I've not read into the future of what that is. That was,
Huh.
and so, and in the end, actually, I don't know. I assume it must have all worked out fine. I never heard another thing beyond the fact of, beyond my testimony and all of that. But that was, it was a very interesting case because, again, you had two appraisers, both respected, both well known. I completely can understand where the other appraiser was coming from.
Did you
But
know
that
the other
wasn't,
appraiser?
I did.
Ah,
And someone I respect. It's not
sure.
that and the reality is I don't know what her, and I don't know how they phrased her assignment.
Uh-huh.
Her assignment might very well have been, well, what can I get for these photographs today? And that might be
Sure.
cost based.
Right.
But that was not my assignment. I was engaged to determine what was the value as of the day of death. That is a what is done with those pieces of information is beyond my pay grade. But as far as what is the doing what you are asked and answering that question, being very clear about that.
Was that the eventuality that you were prepared for by your attorney? Did they let you know that they're going to ask you something like that and try and trip you up? Did they help you? Did they help guide you at all to answer the opposing counsel's questions in the manner that you did, or was it just your instincts?
I think it was more instinct. I don't remember there being a whole lot of preparation in terms of getting ready for the testimony, much less
Oh,
the
that's interesting.
deposition. We might have spent an hour on the phone in terms of I wouldn't even call it a deposition. Really, it was just kind of a prep, more than
Huh.
anything else. Because we had done a report. I mean, we had done a full-on appraisal report, had submitted
Sure.
that, and our reports are very detailed. Kind of underscoring where we've come from and all of that. So I think that perhaps limited, or some of the time that we would have otherwise been required.
Okay.
Um, you know, and funny enough, that was actually my first time on the stand. I had been deposed before, but not actually, funny enough,
Not
I just
cross-examined.
remembered. I just remembered another one that was a mediation. I guess I have done a little bit more than
Sure.
than I remember.
Sure.
Which I guess over 30 years, it starts to evaporate.
Sure.
Um, but that one, um, there wasn't a lot of preparation. Maybe after the report was done, I kind of feel like maybe it was 2 to 3 hours, of which two-thirds of whatever that time was kind of, just on my own, making sure that everything was all kind of logically laid out. But, it is it was what it was. It wasn't as if there was any, I'm speaking to my research and my expert opinion. It's not an area where, you know, if I've done my job correctly, I should be able to withstand whatever questions, either my client or the opposing counsel have.
So, in other words, that's interesting. So, extra prep. If you had to put over again, in other words, you wouldn't say to yourself, "Oh boy, I wish that I had done more prep."
No, I would have said I wish I'd had a bigger breakfast because the day was just the day was just so long. Like it just, by the time you, I think it was 7 hours, and maybe like a half an hour lunch or something like that. I just remember that by the time I had gotten through opposing counsel, I was just I was tired. I was
I mean, a
mentally
big
tired.
breakfast is pretty good advice.
Yeah, that would be that'd be the best advice I could give.
You're not the first expert who has told me that the opposing counsel, one of their tactics is to kind of wear you down and fatigue you. And so make sure that you've eaten enough and drank enough water and make sure that you're ready in that manner. It's actually pretty
Well,
good advice.
one of the things I thought that actually was very, in comparing the two, right? Obviously, with the counsel that had hired us, we're kind of like I kind of knew what the questions were going to be, and they were all very logical questions. It wasn't as if these were things that weren't, um, uh, surprising by any means.
Sure.
What I remember being very frustrating was that opposing counsel would repeatedly try to rephrase the exact same question about 50 maybe this might be some degree of hyperbole, but 50 different ways. And it just, I keep coming back to the exact same answer. Like I I understand what you are trying to do. I understand where you are trying to get to. It doesn't change the outcome. So that's what gets a little bit exhausting, the repetition of the of the
Just reframing the question,
re,
try to get
re,
you to change your
re,
answer.
reframing the question. And again, when you're speaking to, I will use the word fact here, but the reality is that whether or not, when you, as far as, the facts that I am speaking, my conclusions are based on whatever facts that I have. And
Sure.
so, that doesn't change. Trying to find different ways of trying to explain different metaphors or different, the different forces that are ultimately in play and making your determinations. Yeah, it can be a bit exhausting, but that's.
Did they try to impeach you as a witness? Did they try and say that you're not expert enough? They didn't try any of those sorts of tactics on you.
No, they did not. Um, and it was interesting because that, funny enough, that did come up because at that point I had not been recognized as an expert witness. And actually, I'm going back to it. I do remember the opening
Sure.
statements from counsel was to get the court to accept me as a expert witness.
Sure.
So
We were talking about reports. When you're engaged to write a report, have you typically been given some kind of a skeletal outline where you fill in the little expert bits, or have you written it full cloth?
full cloth. The only exception to that is this was many years ago. We were hired by an insurance company on an insurance case, and um, they did not want us to do an appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted us to act as a consultant, and so we have to be, very careful in terms of, how we were doing and what we were doing. And I think this case is actually even reported somewhere, but the facts of how it is reported are not 100% are not 100% accurate, in part
Okay.
because it was a consultancy and not a full-on appraisal. But as far as USPAP is concerned, I think today, we did render a value opinion, so it would still qualify as an appraisal. Anyways,
Sure.
the piece that was in question was a unique piece that had received some water damage, and it was a really large piece. It was a mural piece, and it wasn't a question as to whether or not um, uh, everyone knew there was some value, and there was a little bit of a disagreement in terms of what the value would have been prior to the damage. So the first
Mm-hmm.
objective was just to get all parties to agree that, let's start at least, that can all parties agree that this is going to be the value, had there been um no difference in the value. And the that starting price before damage was in the seven figures, very
Okay.
low seven figures. The 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 insured had hired an appraiser, very well known, very reputable appraiser, and they produced a beautiful report. I think it was 50 pages. Um, and that report had basically come to a valuation conclusion of well under six figures.
Okay.
Okay. So, but there wasn't really a reason given as to how that number was determined. It was
Okay.
just it was just stated, opinion of the appraiser is X. So they had asked us, the insurance company had asked us to write an opinion of value. And our report, I think, was basically 7 pages. And it went through three different ways of how the value could be looked at.
Sure.
And one of the arguments in there was in actuality, while it might not necessarily at the full retail price, because sorry, I forgot to mention the print had undergone restoration, considerable restoration,
Sure.
and in because this was such a large mural print, the appraisers, we all went and looked at it in situ. Um, it had some undulations. Like there were still some, because there was some water, it was some water damage and had been treated. There were some undulations, not in, it was a multi-panel piece. Um, and there were still some tide marks that if you got up close to it, you could see those tide marks. But
Okay.
the reality is that the undulations, because it was such a large piece already, it was a little bit hard to notice that. And unless you're standing right up to the print, you're not going to really notice the undulations. That's not how the piece is intended to be
To be
viewed.
viewed.
It's like it's meant to be viewed from a distance.
Right.
So part of the rationale that we had used in our valuation is that this would be unaffordable for some smaller museums, for example, that would love to fundraise around this.
Hmm.
And it would have to be at a reduced price, and so we had gone through some different ways of looking at what those reduced prices would be in relationship to an undamaged print. And in the end, that was what our report was. And so this was obviously going to trial, and we had gotten to the deposition side of it, and counsel was like, "So, what are you going to say when the judge asks you, how do you know your value is right?" And I remember saying to him, and I said, "Well, I'm going to answer, I don't know that my value is right. That's up to the court to decide. But I can tell you how I got to my value, and I have a logical and rational and clear approach. You can either agree or disagree with that." To which the opposing counsel, or to which a counsel said, "We're done here." He goes, "That's all I really needed to hear." Because as far as counsel was concerned, that was regardless of who was right or who was wrong, having the basis as to how it was determined was critical. That was the key.
Do you know if your side prevailed in that case?
So interestingly, just in the last few years, so it was settled. It didn't ended up not going
Oh,
to court. It did settle.
interesting.
And I actually did happen to find out that because of the way that the settlement was, um, I I'm happy to report that I feel that my valuation was justified. I'll put
Ah,
it
okay.
that way.
Sure. Well, is that, this is something that I like to ask all of my guests actually is that something that's important to you? Is it important that your side prevails, or is it just important to you that you give, your best expert testimony for the given case? Is that a factor for you?
I would say in the end, the truth and the best argument should win. It's important. I'd say that, the amount of thought that goes into any argument, whether it be for expert witness or any appraisal, it's well thought out. There's a reason behind it.
Sure.
Being human, like I can't. It would be hubris to say, well, my way is always right. Like that's you know, it's a matter of being open, and to me, and therefore to the firm, it is most important to seek the right answer, even if those results aren't the results. That's case in point. Whenever going back to where we had started, when I talk to counsel, I think it's very important to explain where I would be coming from. Once we're in agreement in terms of how we're approaching this, you can either, you can either decide to or not decide to, and the results are going to be what they're going to be.
Sure. So you're
You
talking
know,
about vetting them in the first place when they first make contact with you before you decide to take a case on?
not so
Or
much
you talk
me vetting them the other way around. I mean, like I like to have
Sure,
full
sure.
yeah, yeah. Really, it's a matter of full disclosure. I mean, like this is how we would look at it.
Right. And it's important that you both get that information before the engagement, because you don't want any surprises, right? When you find out that
That has less to
that
do with to me, that has less to do with appraising and more about better business, about good business. The
huh,
reality is that, I think that being very clear, being very honest, and I think it was interesting because I think when we were talking about that one case where we had recused ourselves in the discussions that we were having, um, the counsel that had contacted us first was looking for a very high number. And
Mm,
the number that the conclusion they were telling me exactly where they were coming from, and I didn't
right,
agree. And I said, listen, I said, because I didn't know at this point that we would have to recuse ourselves either. But
right,
again, I'd never be able to approach it that way. And I explained to him why that would be the case. And actually, and despite, again, getting everyone on the same page, they didn't know our market. And once I explained that to them and how those calculations and how those determinations are made, they were still interested in proceeding. Again, they're looking for the right, everyone should be looking for the right answer.
right. Right. Of course. At the end of the day, that's, your reputation's on the line as well, right? You don't want
Absolutely,
to,
absolutely.
you don't want to, give bad information and then not get another job as an expert witness.
No, correct. Absolutely. No, I take it very seriously. In terms of the, you know, I don't think of it in terms of being right or wrong because I'm working always on the assumption I'm trying to come to the correct answer. And
Sure.
answers can often be, sometimes people aren't necessarily um forthcoming with information. And so
Sure.
conclusions can be, can change. And so that's also equally important. Um, so there are a lot of variables that get caked into that, but I think, obviously, acting ethically, being very clear and very forthright in terms of what your positions are and how you would approach it. I
Sure.
think just in a simple business transaction, if they're looking to hire you as an expert witness, they should have your reputation has gotten you the meeting. Now,
Right.
the beyond that is a matter of saying, okay, now this is how we would deal with it. I would rather be upfront knowing what the basic circumstances and not know what the interest of the parties are because I don't, I want to be isolated from that. I don't want to be influenced by any party's interests. I want to look at the facts. And so, those are that's the most important thing to me.
Do you enjoy it? Is it something you'd like to continue to do?
Um, I'll put it to you this way. Whenever we get I look at each request that comes as on its merits, like I do look at it. I I enjoy thinking. I don't necessarily enjoy having to be on the stand.
Right. Right. Sure.
I like analysis. I like thinking. I like writing. Um, you know, some things are a little bit more. I'll use the word toxic. Like just I don't like to be in those. Like where it's just
Sure.
real. That's more of a personal choice more than a professional choice.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the last thing that I'd like to pivot to before we wrap up is getting paid. This is something that everybody wants to know is how everybody charges. Some people I do everything project based, and some people like hourly. Some people take a retainer. Do you have any recommendations? Has something worked? I know that you haven't done this too much, but you've been doing it for a while. So, what do you recommend to newer experts who aren't exactly sure how to bill?
So I do think that by the hour. For example, we actually do bill so our time on the stand and deposition work is billed differently than preparation work.
Okay.
And so, we will usually work with an allotment of hours. So as an example, like we will get when someone does come with us, we usually won't give the estimate for the testimony because we just don't know how that's going to play out. But we
Right.
will work off of a retainer based on the X number of hours for expert witness or, in preparation for, whether that be in a or whatever. But yes, we work on retainer,
Okay.
but which is based on of which the calculation is based on hourly rates.
Sure, absolutely. Do you have any last advice that you have for newer experts or attorneys out there who are working with newer experts?
So I do, I think that there are actual programs that help appraisers to write reports for, as well as gain skills that are necessary um, to be effective uh, expert witnesses. The Appraisers Association of America offers these programs usually about once a year. It's always good to just kind of check their website in terms of things that offerings, educational offerings that they have. But it's very interesting because when they do offer them, the classes actually usually always fill up. It is a topic that people are very interested in,
Huh.
and so they they're, it's important to have your skills boned up. I think in terms of both from the writing, the appraisal report writing aspect of it, as well as being effective on the stand. I think
Absolutely.
that, I think from as far as being on the stand, I think it's important to be calm, confident, and remember your audience. When you're there as an expert witness, more like you're there because you are an expert. And so a lot of times I will often speak in metaphor, in part because the people that aren't in appraising or don't
Hmm.
necessarily know the nuances of what we're doing might have a hard time relating and understanding the concepts that are involved. And so, for me, when I am having to give testimony, I will lay the groundwork relative to my particular jargon or, my particular area of expertise, but I'll often
Sure.
come back and revisit it so that way I can try and use an analogy, and I often use real estate, funny enough, because most people's experience when it comes to appraisal relates to real estate. And so
Sure.
it's very
Absolutely.
easier to be able to draw those kinds of well, sure, in general, real estate is a little bit more liquid than art, but it also provides more utility than art, and so understanding, you start tapping into the recesses of people's brains are like, oh yeah, I do remember those terms in economics, or and you're like, it's just reintroducing that back to them so that way they get where you're coming from. Trying to make that connection, I think, as an expert witness is very important for the court.
That's very sage advice. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining me here today on Discussions at the Roundtable.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Noah.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another Discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcast or your favorite listening apps.